This morning I woke up to the sound of bulldozers tearing through my pasture, ripping up fence posts that my grandfather had installed with his own hands, and destroying 40 years of careful land management in the name of community improvement. The HOA president, a woman who had never worked a day of honest labor in her life, stood at the edge of my property with a clipboard and a smug smile, directing the destruction like she was conducting an orchestra. When I ran outside in my boots and work clothes to demand an explanation, she handed me a piece of paper and said, "This is a court-approved easement for emergency access road construction. Your opposition to community safety improvements ends today." That piece of paper would turn out to be worth less than the ink it was printed on, but the devastation it caused to my family's century-old ranch was very real. Little did she know that she had just declared war on someone whose family had been fighting for this land longer than her precious HOA had even existed. What happened next would cost her everything she thought she had built, and teach her that some fights are more expensive than you can possibly imagine. But let me start from the beginning, because this story of David versus Goliath gets so much more satisfying when you understand exactly how deep the corruption went. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a fourth-generation rancher whose family has been working the same 240 acres in Clearwater Valley since 1923. My great-grandfather bought this land with money he saved from working the railroad, and every generation since has poured their blood, sweat, and dreams into making it better. We run a small but successful cattle operation, grow our own hay, and have spent decades building the kind of sustainable ranch that actually improves the land instead of exploiting it. The Clearwater Valley used to be nothing but working ranches and family farms, the kind of place where neighbors helped each other during calving season and everyone knew that your word was your bond. That started changing about 8 years ago when Pinnacle Development Company began buying up land and converting it into what they called luxury rural estates, oversized houses on 5-acre lots for city people who wanted to play cowboy on the weekends. At first, the development didn't affect us much. The new residents kept to themselves, and some of them were actually pretty decent people who respected the fact that they had moved into an agricultural area. But about 3 years ago, something changed. The development had grown large enough to incorporate as its own homeowners association, and they elected a woman named Victoria Sterling as their president. Victoria was everything you'd expect from someone who had bought $1 million house so she could complain about the smell of cattle. She had moved from the city with her investment banker husband and immediately began a campaign to elevate the standards of Clearwater Valley. This meant complaining about early morning farm work, trying to ban livestock from areas where livestock had grazed for over a century, and generally making life miserable for anyone who had been here longer than her credit check. The trouble started last spring when Victoria announced that the HOA was concerned about emergency access to their development. The main road into Pinnacle Estates was a well-maintained private road that connected to the county highway about 2 miles from my ranch. But Victoria had convinced the HOA board that they needed a second access route in case the main road was ever blocked by snow, flooding, or other emergencies. Her proposed solution was to build a road that would cut directly through my ranch, connecting her development to the county highway via the shortest possible route. Never mind that this would destroy some of my best pasture land, disrupt my water systems, and create a permanent scar across property that had been in my family for 4 generations. When Victoria first approached me about selling an easement for this road, I was polite but firm in my refusal. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, "this ranch has been in my family for almost a century. That pasture you want to pave over is some of the most productive grazing land in the valley. I'm not interested in selling." Victoria's response should have warned me about what was coming. Instead of accepting my decision or trying to negotiate, she got that look that entitled people get when someone tells them no. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I think you're being very short-sighted about this. It would be much better for everyone if we could work this out amicably." When I asked what she meant by that, she smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Well, there are many ways that properties can be improved or regulated. The county has been very responsive to our concerns about agricultural practices and their impact on residential property values." I should have started documenting everything right then. I should have hired a lawyer and started preparing for war. Instead, I made the mistake of thinking that reasonable people could be dealt with reasonably. I told Victoria that my answer was final and that I hoped she could find another solution that didn't involve destroying my family's land. 6 months later, I learned exactly what Victoria had meant by working this out amicably. It started with a series of complaints to the county about my ranch operations. Someone reported that my cattle were creating environmental hazards, and that my water usage was excessive and potentially illegal. Someone else filed complaints about agricultural odors, and claimed that my early morning feeding schedule was creating a public nuisance. Every complaint was anonymous, but they all had the same professionally written tone and the same focus on finding reasons to impose restrictions on my ranch operations. The county was required to investigate each complaint, which meant regular visits from inspectors who found nothing wrong but who had to spend time and resources responding to Victoria's harassment campaign. Then came the property tax reassessment. Somehow, my ranch had been reclassified from agricultural land to transitional development property, which tripled my annual tax bill overnight. When I went to the county assessor's office to protest, I was told that the reclassification had been requested by concerned citizens, who believed that my property was no longer being used primarily for agriculture. I spent $5,000 in legal fees fighting the tax reclassification and eventually won, but the message was clear. Victoria Sterling was willing to use every bureaucratic weapon she could find to make my life miserable until I gave her what she wanted. The final warning came in the form of a visit from a county code enforcement officer who informed me that someone had complained about unpermitted structures on my ranch. These unpermitted structures turned out to be a hay barn that my father had built in 1987 and a small equipment shed that had been grandfathered in when the county updated its building codes in the 1990s. I was able to provide documentation for both buildings, but the code enforcement officer looked genuinely uncomfortable as he explained that he was required to inspect every structure on my property in response to the complaint. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've never seen complaint campaigns like what's been happening to you. Someone really wants to make your life difficult." That's when I finally understood that Victoria Sterling wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted, and that playing defense wasn't going to be enough. I started documenting everything, every inspection, every complaint, every interaction with county officials. I hired a lawyer who specialized in property rights cases. And I started doing my own research into Victoria Sterling and her HOA. What I found was fascinating and terrifying. Victoria had used similar tactics against 3 other property owners in the past 2 years. In each case, she had identified properties that were adjacent to or useful for her HOA's expansion plans, and then launched systematic harassment campaigns designed to force the owners to sell or comply with her demands. 2 of the 3 previous targets had eventually given in. One family had sold their small farm to Pinnacle Development at below-market prices after 18 months of constant legal and bureaucratic pressure. Another property owner had agreed to sell an easement for a utility line after Victoria's complaints had resulted in $20,000 in legal and compliance costs. But the third case was different. A retired couple named the Hendersons had refused to sell part of their property for a community garden that Victoria wanted to build. After a year of harassment similar to what I was experiencing, the Hendersons had fought back with their own lawyer and had discovered something interesting. Several of Victoria's complaints had contained false information, and at least one document had contained forged signatures. The Hendersons had filed a lawsuit against Victoria and the HOA for harassment and fraud. The case was still working its way through the courts, but it had effectively ended Victoria's campaign against them. More importantly, it had established a pattern of behavior that could be useful if I needed to take legal action myself. I was studying the Henderson case files when Victoria made her final, devastating move. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and I was doing the routine maintenance that keeps a ranch running, checking fence lines, moving cattle to fresh pasture, and preparing for the winter feeding season. I heard heavy equipment running somewhere nearby, but I assumed it was related to construction at the Pinnacle Development. Around 10 a.m. I got a call from my neighbor, Bill Patterson, whose property bordered mine to the east. "Jake," he said, and his voice sounded shaky, "you need to get over to your south pasture right now. There are bulldozers on your land and they're tearing everything up." I jumped in my truck and drove across the ranch toward the area Bill was talking about. What I saw when I crested the hill made my stomach drop to my boots. 3 large bulldozers were methodically destroying my best pasture, ripping up fence posts, pushing over the mature oak trees that provided shade for my cattle, and scraping away the topsoil that had taken decades to build up. A crew of workers was laying out surveyor stakes for what was clearly going to be a road, cutting a straight line from the county highway toward the Pinnacle Development. I parked my truck and ran toward the nearest bulldozer, waving my arms and shouting for them to stop. The operator shut down his machine and climbed down to meet me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "This is private property. You're destroying my pasture." The operator, a middle-aged man who looked as confused as I felt, handed me a folded piece of paper. "Sir, we have a work order and a court-approved easement for emergency road construction. We're just doing the job we were hired for." I unfolded the paper and tried to make sense of what I was reading. It was an official-looking document with a county seal, describing a temporary emergency access easement across my property for the purpose of providing secondary access to the Pinnacle Estates development. The document was signed by a county judge and referenced several legal codes that I didn't understand. "This has to be some kind of mistake," I said. "Nobody contacted me about any easement. I never agreed to any road construction." The operator shrugged. "Sir, I just work for the construction company. If you have questions about the paperwork, you'll need to talk to whoever hired us. Our job is to build the road according to the survey stakes." That's when I saw Victoria Sterling standing at the edge of my property with her clipboard and her smugger-than-usual smile. She was directing the destruction of my family's land like she was planning a garden party. I stormed over to where she was standing. "Victoria, what the hell is this? You can't just bring bulldozers onto my property." She looked up from her clipboard with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation and was prepared to enjoy it. "Good morning, Jake. As you can see, we're moving forward with the emergency access road that we discussed. This is all completely legal and properly approved." "Legal? I never agreed to any road. This is my property." Victoria handed me a copy of the same document the bulldozer operator had shown me. "Actually, the county determined that this easement is necessary for public safety. Property owners don't have the right to block emergency access when it's been properly approved by the courts." I stared at the document, trying to understand how this could be happening. When was this approved? Why wasn't I notified? "All proper legal procedures were followed," Victoria said. "If you have questions about the process, you're welcome to contact the county. In the meantime, I'd suggest that you move your cattle away from the construction area for their own safety." I spent the next hour on the phone with the county, trying to find someone who could explain how an easement had been approved across my property without my knowledge. What I learned made me angrier than I had ever been in my life. The emergency access easement had been approved through an expedited process that was typically used for actual emergencies, things like natural disasters that required immediate access for rescue vehicles. Victoria had somehow convinced a county judge that the lack of secondary access to her development constituted an emergency that justified seizing part of my property through eminent domain. The process had included a legal notice period, but the notice had been published in a legal newspaper that I had never heard of and had never seen. There had been a hearing where I could have presented my objections, but I had never been personally notified that the hearing was taking place. Everything was technically legal, but it was designed to prevent property owners from defending their rights. Victoria had found a bureaucratic loophole that allowed her to steal my land through the court system, and she had executed it perfectly. By the end of the day, the bulldozers had carved a 50-foot wide scar across 800 feet of my best pasture. They had destroyed about $15,000 worth of fencing, killed 3 mature oak trees that had been providing shade and erosion control for over 50 years, and contaminated my main stock pond with runoff from the construction. But the financial damage was nothing compared to the psychological impact of watching strangers destroy something that 4 generations of my family had built and protected. That evening, I called the lawyer I had been working with and told him what had happened. His response was not encouraging. "Jake, what they did is legally complex but probably valid. Emergency easements are hard to fight because they're designed to be implemented quickly. The fact that you weren't personally notified is problematic, but it might not be enough to invalidate the easement. So they can just take my land? The easement gives them the right to use your land for the road, but you still own the underlying property. The bigger problem is that fighting this is going to be expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee that you'll win. What if I just block the road? Put up a gate or a fence?" There was a long pause. "Jake, I wouldn't recommend that. If the easement is valid, blocking it could result in criminal charges and a lawsuit for interfering with a court order." I spent that night walking my property and trying to process what had happened. The road construction had destroyed not just my pasture, but also my faith in the idea that property rights meant something in America. Victoria Sterling had used the legal system as a weapon, and she had won without even having to justify her actions to the person whose land she was taking. But as I stood looking at the destruction in the moonlight, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back, and I was going to make sure that Victoria Sterling learned that some victories come with a price she couldn't afford to pay. The next morning I started making phone calls. The first was to a private investigator I found through my lawyer, a former police detective named Mike Santos who specialized in corporate and government corruption cases. "Mr. Morrison," Mike said after I had explained the situation, "what happened to you sounds like a textbook case of bureaucratic manipulation. Give me a week to look into this Victoria Sterling and her HOA. If there's dirt to be found, I'll find it. The second call was to a different lawyer, one who specialized in RICO cases and civil rights violations. If Victoria was running a systematic scheme to defraud property owners, I wanted someone who could hit her with everything the law allowed. The third call was to a journalist at the county newspaper who had been writing about development controversies in the area. I wanted to make sure that Victoria's victory got the public attention it deserved. While I was assembling my counterattack, Victoria was moving forward with phase 2 of her plan. The road construction continued for another week, with crews installing culverts, grading the surface and preparing for paving. My pasture was being transformed into a suburban road, complete with storm drains and utility easements. But Victoria had made one critical error in her planning. She had assumed that I would either give up or limit myself to purely legal responses. She had not considered the possibility that someone whose family had been ranching for 4 generations might have learned a few things about fighting dirty. On the Monday morning when the paving crew was scheduled to begin work, they arrived to find that someone had driven about 500 head of cattle into the construction area overnight. The cattle were grazing peacefully on what was left of my pasture, but they were also standing directly in the path of the planned road. When the construction foreman called to complain, I was polite but unhelpful. "I'm sorry about the confusion," I said. "Those cattle must have gotten through a break in the fence that was damaged during your construction. I'll get them moved as soon as I can, but it might take a few days to round them all up." Of course the cattle weren't lost, I had moved them there deliberately. And they weren't going to be easy to move because I had been feeding them in that area for the past week, which meant they considered it their home range. Victoria arrived on the scene within an hour, accompanied by the construction foreman and someone who appeared to be a lawyer. She was angrier than I had ever seen her, which was saying something. "Get those animals out of the construction area immediately," she demanded. I was sitting on my horse, wearing my work clothes and trying to look like a simple rancher who was just trying to deal with a livestock problem. "I'm doing my best, Mrs. Sterling. Unfortunately, your construction crew damaged several sections of fence, and my cattle got confused about where they're supposed to be. This is deliberate interference with a legal construction project." I tipped my hat politely. "Ma'am, these cattle have been grazing this pasture for longer than your development has existed. They're just trying to get back to familiar ground." The lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, if you don't remove these animals immediately, we'll be forced to take legal action." "I understand your frustration," I said. "But I can't just snap my fingers and make cattle disappear. This is going to require some careful handling to avoid spooking them." What I didn't mention was that I had been training those cattle for the past month to respond to specific whistle signals, and that I could have moved them off the road in about 20 minutes if I had wanted to. Instead, I spent the next 3 days trying to round them up, while the construction crew sat idle and Victoria's road project fell further behind schedule. On Thursday morning, Victoria played her final card. I was served with legal papers at my front door by a sheriff's deputy who looked apologetic about the whole thing. "Mr. Morrison, I'm required to serve you with these documents. You're being sued for $100,000 in damages for interfering with a legally mandated construction project." The lawsuit was everything I had expected and worse. Victoria and the HOA were claiming that my deliberate interference with the road construction had cost them over $100,000 in delays, equipment rental fees and contractor expenses. They were also seeking an injunction that would give them the right to remove my cattle by force and to charge me for any future delays. Most seriously, they were claiming that my actions constituted criminal interference with a court order, and they were asking the district attorney to file charges that could result in jail time. That evening, I sat in my kitchen reading through the lawsuit and realized that Victoria had finally made the mistake I had been waiting for. In her eagerness to crush me completely, she had filed a lawsuit that contained dozens of specific factual claims about dates, costs, and procedures. If any of those claims were false, she would be vulnerable to charges of fraud and perjury. More importantly, the lawsuit would give my lawyer the right to demand discovery access to all of Victoria's records, communications, and financial documents related to the road project and the easement process. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told him I was ready to fight. 2 weeks later, the private investigator I had hired called with news that changed everything. "Mr. Morrison, I think you're going to want to sit down for this. Victoria Sterling and her HOA have been running a systematic fraud scheme, and your case is just the tip of the iceberg." Mike Santos had discovered that the emergency access easement that had been used to justify taking my land was based on falsified emergency response reports. Victoria had claimed that the county fire department and EMS services had identified the lack of secondary access to her development as a critical safety issue, but when Mike contacted those agencies directly, they had no record of any such assessment. Even more damaging, the expedited court process that had been used to approve the easement had involved forged documents and perjured testimony. Victoria had submitted sworn statements claiming that she had made good faith efforts to negotiate with me for a voluntary easement, but Mike had found email records proving that she had planned to use the emergency process from the beginning, regardless of whether I was willing to negotiate. But here's the really interesting part, Mike continued. This isn't the first time she's done this. I found records of 3 other cases where she used similar tactics to acquire property for HOA projects. In each case, she manipulated the emergency easement process to take land from property owners who had refused to sell. Can we prove it? We can prove all of it. I have documents, recordings, and witness statements. Victoria Sterling is looking at multiple felony charges for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. And that's just the criminal side. The civil liability could be in the millions. The next day, my lawyer filed a motion to dismiss Victoria's lawsuit and submitted a criminal complaint to the district attorney's office. We also filed our own civil lawsuit against Victoria, the HOA, and Pinnacle Development Company for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of my civil rights. The motion hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late November, and the courtroom was packed with people who had heard about the case through media coverage. Victoria arrived with 3 lawyers and the confident demeanor of someone who expected to win easily. She was not prepared for what happened next. My lawyer began by presenting evidence that the entire emergency easement process had been based on fraudulent documents. He showed the court email records proving that Victoria had planned to use the emergency process regardless of whether legitimate negotiations were attempted. He presented testimony from fire department officials stating that they had never identified any emergency access issues with the Pinnacle development. Most damaging of all, he played a recording that Mike Santos had obtained of Victoria bragging to another HOA president about how easy it was to manipulate the system to acquire property from stubborn landowners. Victoria's lead lawyer tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the time my lawyer finished his presentation, Victoria looked like she was going to be sick. The judge's response was swift and devastating. He immediately dismissed Victoria's lawsuit against me and ordered a criminal investigation into the fraudulent easement process. He also issued a temporary restraining order preventing any further construction on the road until the legal issues could be resolved. Mrs. Sterling, the judge said, looking directly at Victoria, if these allegations are proven true, you will be facing serious criminal charges. I suggest you consult with criminal defense counsel immediately. 3 months later, Victoria Sterling pled guilty to multiple felony charges including fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $2 million in restitution to the property owners she had defrauded. The HOA was forced to pay for the complete restoration of my pasture, including new fencing, soil remediation, and replacement of the mature trees that had been destroyed. The fraudulent easement was voided, and the partially constructed road was removed at the HOA's expense. Pinnacle Development Company, facing potential bankruptcy from the legal settlements, was forced to sell the development to a company that actually respected property rights and environmental regulations. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, I was standing in my restored pasture watching my cattle graze on grass that was greener and thicker than it had been before the destruction. The soil restoration process had actually improved the land, and the new fencing was stronger and more durable than what had been destroyed. My lawyer had suggested that I consider this a victory and move on with my life. But as I watched the sunset over land that 4 generations of my family had protected and improved, I realized that the real victory wasn't the money or the legal vindication. The real victory was proving that in America, property rights still mean something. That powerful people can't just take what they want from honest working families. And that sometimes, when you fight back against bullies and thieves, you don't just win, you make sure they can never hurt anyone else the same way. Today, the Clearwater Valley is back to being a place where neighbors help each other and where people's word means something. The new owners of what used to be Pinnacle Estates are respectful of the agricultural community they moved into. And Victoria Sterling is discovering that orange jumpsuits don't come with clipboards or the authority to destroy other people's lives. Sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure that justice is served, and that the people who think they're above the law learn that no one is too powerful to face the consequences of their actions. And sometimes, the most satisfying victory is watching your cattle graze on land that bullies tried to steal, knowing that your family's legacy is stronger than any scheme that entitled people can devise.